much for joining us for this evening's concert. This is the Highland High School Band Spring Concert. We are so excited to have you with us tonight. We are so grateful for Century for hosting us and allowing us to use their facilities and their equipment. This would not be possible without them. So we really appreciate Jimmy Petoskey and the custodial staff and administration of Century for helping us out. This concert is going to be so much fun. We have a fun set of music for you. But as I've been thinking over the last few days rehearsing with the band, one thing that's really fun for me is just thinking about how far these groups have come this year. And we hope that as you hear the groups play, that you can hear the progress they've made, and hopefully you can see that they're better musicians now than when the year started. So it should be a fun night, and we're glad you're here with us. We're starting with jazz band, and our first piece is Critical Mass by Jeff Jarvis.
Thank you.
That's when I played in high school on Barry Sack, so I had a lot of fun with that as a kid too. I want to recognize our soloists. I wrote it down. I'm always nervous that I'm going to forget a name or mispronounce something, so I wrote it down and I'll just read it so I don't miss it. But on that one we have Jacob, Nathan, Valeria, Spencer, Ethan, and Caleb that solo. So let's give them another hand. Our next one is a well-known tune. The Glenn Miller Orchestra played it way back in the day. In the Mood by Joe Garland. Hope you enjoy it. So sometimes when I'm picking music, I pick a whole lot to sight read through, and I have the students help me decide, because they're going to be playing it for a while, so it's fun to have them help me pick, and they really wanted to play music. So I'm glad we did it. It's fun. Let's see, we had Everett, Miles, and Ethan, Ricky on solo. So let's give them another one. I messed up. Yeah. Our last piece for jazz band is it's a a real fun one. It's La Suerte de los Tontos, which means fortune of fools or luck of the dumb. There's a few different translations for it, but really fun Latin piece. And let me go ahead and read the solos. So we have Allison, Andrew, and Miles. So we'll know this one. La Suerte de los Tontos. jazz band, that's so fun. We are going to set up for percussion ensemble, and that should be pretty quick, so give us just a minute or two while we transition to discussion. Let's give jazz band another round of applause. We're finishing up, I'll announce their pieces. They're starting with Free Rider by Patrick Speranza, and the composer on this one kind of envisions in a video game, you're battling the final boss. So it's kind of a video game vibe and just kind of an epic battle that is trying to be portrayed here. So it's a pretty fun piece. After that, you'll hear percussion ensemble play Ephemera by Francisco Perez. And ephemera, I had to look up the definition, but it means lasting for a very short time. And it's a very ethereal piece. It even marks, in the style right at the beginning, it says, from another place. So very ethereal, and the groove kind of shifts all the time. And so it's pretty demanding, and it's a beautiful piece as well. So hope you enjoy percussion ensemble with Free Rider and Ephemera. We'll need a minute to make a quick change here for Ephemera. I want to introduce to you Brandon Hansen. He's our drumline instructor. He helps us so much year-round with this class, with percussion ensemble. He's such an expert at what he does, and I'm so grateful that he is here to help the students learn so much more about percussion. So you'll see him helping us tonight, and you can play with us a little bit later too. So give Brandon a hand. Some of the pieces they're playing. This first one is a set called Chrysanna's Colors by Robert W. Smith. And the concert band actually played the first movement of this, Red, a few years ago. And we played it at festival the day before the fire. So I've wanted to play the other movement since, and I just felt like it was a good fit. So we're playing that tonight. So we're playing Red, Blue, and Yellow. And this doesn't specify an order, but I picked that order because I think it sounds good. But it's kind of a cool piece. So Chrysanna's Colors is dedicated to a student named Chrysanna. And we don't have a lot of information about her, but each of them has a clarinet solo in it. So kind of assume that Chrysanna was probably a clarinet player. That's just an assumption, but it makes sense. But Chrysanna, she faced a lot of challenges and difficulties in her life, and but despite all that, she brought a lot of cheer to people, and she loved color. She would always point out colors in what people were wearing or in the room, and she would just always compliment people on a certain hue or tint of a color, and she just loved it, and everyone noticed how much color it meant to her. She also assigned days colors, depending on how she was feeling or depending on her mood or the emotions she was feeling. So I want to go over that. So for Chrysanna, a red day was extremely energized and fierce. For blue, if she's having a blue day, it was a sad, reflective day. And if she was having a yellow day, it was bright and cheery, and she always made sure to freely share that with others. So, kind of a cool story behind it, and I hope that you can hear and feel those different moods and emotions as we play Chrysanna's Colors. And it sounds like they're still moving a few things, so I'll go ahead and talk about the last piece too. So they're also playing Prince of Egypt. This was actually suggested by one of the students, and sometimes I hear suggestions like that, and I think, well, I don't even know if there's a band arrangement for it. I love the music to that, so I checked, and there was. So we got Prince of Egypt, and the students have really enjoyed it. And just tells such a good story, and the music is so good. A lot of people longing for freedom, and just captures that longing so well. So we hope you enjoy Red, Blue, and Yellow from Chrysanna's Colors and Prince of Egypt. So I was pointing out to Concert Banana just the other day, we were doing some of our warm-ups, and it's so fun to hear how much they've improved. There's a warm-up that they really like, the Queen's Almond. It's a ballad that's in a minor key, and it's just a lot of fun. We played it, it was either yesterday or the day before, and they just sounded so nice. And I tried to remind them of how they sounded on the same piece back in September. I don't know if they remember, but they've improved a lot, and it's so fun to hear that improvement. So I hope you've been able to hear their progression as well. We're excited for Prince of Egypt, and we hope that you enjoy. Okay. Let's give another hand to concert band. The last group on our program is Symphonic Band. We'll be starting with music from Ben-Hur. There's been several versions of this. This is from the version with Charlton Heston. And I'll tell a little bit of the story that Eric maybe will have to say. He lives in the ancient Roman times, and there's an accident where his sister knocks a tile off the roof and it kills a Roman soldier. Ben-Hur takes the blame and he ends up becoming a slave. That's his punishment for the crime. So he becomes a slave and he's rowing on these battleships. And there's so many cool scenes in this video. There's battles where he's in the bottom of the ship rowing with his fellow slaves, and it's pretty intense. There's some really cool chariot race scenes that I love. So this is just a movie I grew up with, and the music is pretty epic. So I hope you enjoy Ben-Hur. Okay, this next one is a suite from The Man of La Mancha, and this is a musical based on the story of Don Quixote. And the music is really awesome. I've never actually seen the musical, but I've heard several of the songs, and they really helped me find hope in a challenging time in my life. Especially one of the songs near the end, The Impossible Dream. And Don Quixote is kind of eccentric, but he has like unfailing hope and belief in good things and in the world. He said he is a knight who's going to fight for the right and fight for a just cause, even if he's all alone in the world, trying to stand up for what's right. And that was just really meaningful to me at a challenging time in my life. So I hope you enjoy Man of La Mancha. When we were in St. George for our band tour over spring break, they were actually playing this musical that week we were there, and I really hoped to take the students to it. So I've heard so many good things, but the timing didn't work out. We were there on a Monday night, and they weren't showing it on Monday, so we missed out. But we got to play some of the music, so we hope you enjoy Man of La Mancha. Thank you.